Hi, good afternoon and welcome to the European Security Summit discussion on cyber and hybrid threats. I would like to introduce Heli Timakla, who's the Ambassador at Large for Cyber Diplomacy at the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That was a good slip of the tongue. Heli, many thanks for joining us, and we look forward to hearing your keynote address.
Thank you, Ruth, and hello to everybody in this audience. I am very glad addressing this summit, and this year it happens virtually, and during the previous years we had lively chats in Brussels, and this organization team for the event has put together a very impressive program, and I'm glad to see many old Brussels friends presenting, and glad also to see some new faces in the Brussels cyber community. So I will speak about where the EU and its cyber policy sits in the more global picture, what we are now seeing and experiencing in the cybersecurity, and how EU is relating to United Nations and other organizations, and what is the specific role and mission for the European Union in this very broad global domain, which we are all protecting, especially now during the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me start with the United Nations efforts and how we are all addressing the issue of cyber stability. In the United Nations, we have had a decade-long process in the first committee, which is called Group of Governmental Experts, that has drawn up the rules of road, if you like to call it like this, for the state behavior in cyberspace. So we have a very clear understanding that international law should apply. We have norms of responsible state behavior and confidence building measures, which have been discussed mostly in OSCE, but also in ASEAN Regional Forum, in OAS and other regional settings. So in a way, we have a very clear understanding as governments, and we have also endorsed this understanding in the UN General Assembly. What kind of rules of road are there for us in the global cyberspace, and how the governments should behave? The question sometimes comes up asking, but why we still have cyber attacks and why we are still experiencing all these malicious cyber activities? Of course, it's clear that it's not only rules that make cyberspace safer, but it's also the implementation of the rules that must follow. And I think the implementation of those norms and international law is something we all work right now. We have started this work already in more global setting in the UN with new working groups and new initiatives, but all the regional organizations have also very significant role in endorsing those rules that we already have. And I think here the EU has a very great added value with different activities to make sure that cyberspace is more safe domain for us and for the future generations. I will start with the EU activities on setting the common EU approach on international cybersecurity. Since the 2013 EU strategy on cybersecurity, EU has very clearly set out what kind of approach there is amongst the EU member states. And this is to support the existing international law, to support the normative framework in cyberspace, and also support those countries who are less technologically advanced to make sure that they are also prepared for cyber threats and are resilient enough in this new domain. And EU has been doing many efforts so far, and the EU's role in global arena, I think maybe has been bigger than many people might assume, because EU is not always going around and publicizing those efforts. And I think the Brussels cyber community, of course, knows those efforts, but if you allow me, I will repeat some of the achievements that the European Union has been doing. So first on the EU cyber diplomacy toolbox. This is something where we see clear progress achieved in the last year. where sanctions were adopted in July this summer, and we are going forward with the second sanctions package now. So the cyber diplomacy toolbox also has really mainstreamed the understanding of how to respond to cyber attacks and what kind of activities are there available for the member states and the EU to react and respond. And this has been also a very good policy framework for diplomatic community and foreign policy circles, because it somehow mainstreamed cyber to foreign policy circles, and it also mainstreamed foreign policy to cyber circles, because we should not underestimate the difference between those communities. And when we discussed the cyber diplomacy toolbox in the Brussels working groups, then we could see this kind of cross understanding between those different communities increasing. And now I think we are at a good place in order to respond to cyber attacks and take some measures quite quickly if necessary and defend the EU values in the more global cyber domain. So the second feature, what EU has been achieving and which sometimes is publicized and sometimes not, is the capacity building of the European Union. I think the EU has been one of the largest donors together with its member states. And the global resilience building that we need to do in the less advanced countries is something where really the European countries have been front runners. Of course, there are many others doing it, but collectively, I think all of us, the Europeans, we have been there maybe the largest donors so far. Also, we have had some very good success stories collectively with other international organizations like Council of Europe, EU projects on Classy Plus, had the resilience project, Cyber for Dev, and projects in the eastern and southern neighborhood. So all of this has been a very good groundwork for future achievements and future plans. And I understand that the future plans will be mainly laid down in the new EU cyber strategy, now coming up soon, and hopefully we can adopt it sometime in the end of this year or early next year. I wanted to say that going from more practical level to a more philosophical level, EU really is an interesting role model for other regions in the world, because when we discuss cyber issues in the United Nations and elsewhere, I am always asked about how the EU is doing this, how the Europeans are doing smaller bits and pieces and elements in a cyber protection, and our NIS directive, other normative frameworks we have, how we fight cybercrime and so on. This is attractive to other parts of the world. And I think this kind of global capacity building is now something which seems to be one of the major topics when we discuss the way forward with the United Nations cyber developments. There is pressure sometimes from some countries to come up with the idea of a new cyber treaty. And for those actors who might not be up to date with all the issues that have happened in the first committee of the United Nations, and who do not know that we have norms and we have said that existing law applies, the idea of cyber treaty seems attractive. And we, of course, in the European Union and in Estonia, we have been always debating the value of any new instrument or binding instrument in this field, because the new treaty is not going to solve the problems of lack of resilience or cyber instability. Secondly, the treaty in cyberspace is something which we cannot really verify. We do not have this kind of verification mechanism for this dual-use domain. And third aspect why we are against the treaty is that we cannot really spend another 2 decades discussing some sort of new international treaty and not agree that the existing rules and laws apply. I think we should stick to the existing rules and norms, and this is best what we have right now. Estonia has been promoting the international law applying in cyberspace since more than 1 decade. So we have been initiating the Tallinn manual process, where we have 2 Tallinn manuals which discuss how exactly international law applies in cyberspace. And this has been very helpful for other regions in the world, because when we see the broader UN discussions, then sometimes Tallinn manual is the guideline for some of the nations that have not come up with their own articulation of how international law applies in cyberspace. We also train diplomats, and Estonia has been training diplomats in the EU and NATO. We had some summer schools here, and we also had now a virtual cyber diplomacy masterclass, which was open to global public, and we had 3,000 followers from 68 countries, I believe, during the last event. So we intend to do this and to raise awareness in different parts of the world that cyber diplomacy is something where all the ministries of foreign affairs need to start build their own internal capacity. International law is something which is possible to apply in cyberspace, so we do not need a new treaty. And also, we should start calling the culprits and perpetrators in cyberspace with their real names, and we have to make sure that some sort of deterrence measures are in place to secure cyberspace if we want to continue our open, free, and interoperable internet, and make sure that economic and social progress that we have achieved will remain in this domain. And the deterrence is also one element where the European Union has a great value, with the toolbox activities, with the sanctions, with the common statements, declarations, and EU already has shown its ability to use these measures very efficiently. And I hope that all the member states now are going to use it more often and more effectively, because this is a great tool at our disposal to respond to cyber attacks. As our Estonian contribution to more rules-based cyberspace, we, as part of the United Nations Security Council for 2 years, have raised the cyber issues in the Security Council of the United Nations. We raised cyber attacks against Georgia in March, together with the US and United Kingdom, calling out the attacker. And we also have raised awareness in the margins of the Security Council with the events. In May, we organized the ARIA Formula meeting on responsible state behavior, and the attendance of this meeting was really good. The discussion was very substantive, and we intend to raise awareness on cyber stability issues in the Security Council while we are members there. And of course, on the European Union activities, I think we are all looking forward to new EU cyber strategy, and we hope that international security and foreign policy activities of the European Union and the coordination between the member states in this field stays as effective as it has been in recent years. And I thank you for your attention and wish you a very good conference.
Heli, many thanks for that thought-provoking address, which has set us up really well, I think, for our panel session, which will now follow on hybrid threats, international cooperation and diplomacy specifically. It's a complex and fast-paced concept, which arguably kind of melds high-end sophisticated techniques and technology with long-standing ways of warfare and conflict. I'm Ruth Harris. I'm the Director of Defence and Security for RAND Europe. So I'll now introduce the panelists, who will then give a 5 minutes section each of remarks before we move to the Q&A session. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Irina Valentinov, who's the Security and Defence Policy Advisor at the European External Action Service. Welcome. Then Marina Kaljurand, who's the member of the European Parliament. Welcome. And next, Ben Hiller, who's the lead for partner nations and international organizations at Cyber Defense Section in NATO. Welcome, Ben. And then Samantha Seller, who's head of state threats and defense cyber policy at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Welcome, Samantha. And finally, Raj Samani, who's the chief scientist and fellow at McAfee. Welcome, Raj, and I look forward to hearing what you all have to say.
Okay, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you, as I have an honor to replace here my director, Jonneke Belfort, who has a last-minute constraint with a PSC meeting, which took longer than expected. However, I hope that she will be still able to join us soon. I would like to thank the organizers of this summit. It seems to me that we speak about security more and more these recent years, at least within the EU, but it is never enough. And hybrid threats represent a topic, though not new, which is more and more discussed, as we understand that sharing best practices, experience, and lessons learned with our like-minded partners helps us to understand this complex phenomenon and to address it. Indeed, hybrid threats are one of the most serious and sophisticated challenges the EU and its member states are facing these days. They attack our core values, weaken our societies, and try to disintegrate the proper functioning of our states. Although in the field of security, the member states are primarily responsible for protecting their citizens from all different threats by a host of different measures, and with the involvement of a wide range of responsible authorities, the EU can support, coordinate, or supplement the actions of member states. Our objective is to make the EU and its member states resilient enough in all critical sectors to deter hybrid actors, enhance our situational awareness, and protect our societies against these threats. The concept paper or guiding question for this session mentioned explicitly disinformation campaigns and cyber resilience. And Ambassador Tirma Klar has focused on cyber stability in her keynote speech, describing very accurately the EU approach to cybersecurity and international cooperation in the field of cybersecurity in its different dimensions and angles. However, the hybrid threats concept is broader, and both cyber malicious activities and hybrid campaigns represent two, though powerful and most often employed and mostly effectively employed work strands or tools to enablers used by hybrid actors to reach their strategic and overarching objectives, which is undermining public trust in democratic institutions, challenging the core values of our societies, gaining geopolitical influence and power, and affecting the decision-making capability of our countries. But we have to keep in mind that all hybrid actors' national power capacities can be weaponized and used in a coordinated way to achieve strategic end state, be it diplomacy, military, economy, finance, intelligence, information, and so on. For facing such a complex challenge, cooperation is indeed a key. At EU level, one of the first actions identified in 2016 joint framework on countering hybrid threats was building up a shared situational awareness. To this end, so-called hybrid fusion cell was established, gathering all sources hybrid-related information, analyzing them, and providing their assessments to member states. In the field of disinformation, the EU Rapid Alert System provides a platform where member states can exchange their experience and findings. The EU also encourages member states to cooperate with each other on incidents that concern national vulnerabilities and increasing resilience. A dedicated working party in the Council has been established by the Finnish presidency to enhance coordination in the field of countering hybrid threats, where member states can, among others, share best practices. The coordination and information exchange, including lessons learned in the field of hybrid threats, goes beyond intra-EU dimension. We engage with like-minded partners as well. NATO represents a key partner to exchange information with and thus mutually improve our situational awareness. There are other multilateral fora dealing with foreign interference in the G7 format and initiated by Australia. The EU learns a lot from our partners, not just best practices, but also in terms of geographical tendencies and new actors, new tactics. And we consider information exchange with our key partners vital. As we understand that our resilience depends also on the resilience of our partners, this is that famous internal and external nexus as articulated in the European Global Strategy. We reach out to our partners in the neighborhood and offer them a possibility to conduct a hybrid risk self-assessment in the form of questionnaire provided by the EU to identify their key vulnerabilities and subsequently address them with the EU assistance. And with this, I will conclude my introductory remarks. Happy to answer your questions later. Thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to participate in today's discussion, and I'm doing it for the first time in the capacity of the member of the European Parliament. So far, I've been dealing with cybersecurity from the perspective of a government, international organization, civil society, but doing it from the perspective of the European Parliament is also very interesting. So thank you very much for having me. And I don't know if Heli is listening anymore, but Heli, thank you so much for your very good remarks. And, I agree on almost everything you said, but happy to add some of the ideas that might be useful to today's discussion. To start with, I will start with the COVID crisis. We can't avoid it. And although it has been a real tragedy to our people who have lost their lives, at the same time, the COVID crisis has put digital topics into a completely new view. They are on the top of political agendas. They are being discussed, both sides. The benefits that digitalization brings, starting with e-schooling, remote working, but also challenges, starting with connectiveness, cybersecurity, but also digital divides between states, digital divides within societies. So the crisis has helped us to put it more on political agenda and discussion tables. I can't avoid United Nations. I was proud to be member of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on digital cooperation, and I was proud to be one of those who addressed an open letter to the UNGA president, calling on more cooperation in digital sphere, cybersecurity, trust, and stability. And I would argue that although UN has its limits, and I will come to that, at the moment UN is doing a great job in raising awareness, in bringing different sides to the same table, in discussing digital topics and cybersecurity. As a former member of the GG, I understand perfectly the difficulties that UN has. And first of all, digital divide, ideological digital divide. We're using the same words. We're talking about open, free, accessible, secure, stable internet, but look at the practice of states. We are talking about the importance of multi-stakeholder approach and inclusiveness. Look at the practice of the GG and open-ended working group. Although they are good in political slogans, they haven't worked out a good solution for listening to academia, to private sector, to IT sector. And that's why I think that the open letter which was sent to the UN UNGA's presidency was important for calling a new platform where all, not only governments, but all actors can be brought together, will be brought together, and will discuss digitalization and cybersecurity. So I'm not naive about UN, but I see that UN has its role, And I see that in awareness raising, capacity building, confidence building, norms of responsible state behavior, UN can do a lot. Where we can make more progress is regional. And here I agree very much with what Heli said on EU being a global role model. We had GDPR. I would argue that today we are in new position and we have to start introducing new standards for digital services, for example, that most probably, and I hope, will be taken very seriously by also other countries not from our region. I see from the European Parliament perspective that this autumn and this winter, and let's say the whole von der Leyen Commission's time will be really busy on digital topics. So far, von der Leyen has been excellent in her political statements, in putting emphasis on digitalization, putting emphasis on shaping Europe's digital future. So I'm looking forward to the digital strategy. I'm looking forward to the Digital Services Act. I'm looking forward to the review of NIS directive. These are all on the table in the EU at the moment. And we have to address new topics like sovereignty, digital sovereignty, cyber sovereignty. Today I happened to read an excellent blog by Professor Paul Timmers. I don't know if Paul is in the audience, but visit his blog. He had a very good story about how sovereignty and digital sovereignty can be tied to the discussions on the future of Europe if we need to change the treaties, and can be tied to the review of the NIS directive. Thank you, and I'll stop here.
Well, thank you so much also from my side for inviting NATO to this interesting conversation. And I certainly in my introduction would like to also focus more on the cyber aspects when it comes to hybrid threats. And I think this time, obviously, this panel couldn't come at a more timely place in the sense that obviously the COVID-19 pandemic has forced millions of people to stay at home and to rely on information technologies like never before. And what this did, of course, is to increase the attack surface quite significantly, and also underscores the vital importance of coherent cyber defense efforts to dealing with hybrid threats. I believe the pandemic has also shown the length some actors are prepared to go in exploiting a crisis for their malicious purposes, both in cyberspace but also in the information sphere. We've seen malicious cyber activities against healthcare providers and efforts to steal information from companies working on vaccines. And of course, that is unacceptable. But looking at the past and what is happening at the moment, to be absolutely frank, we are witnessing more of the same. And what we are witnessing now is no too different to what we have witnessed in the past, except maybe that there is an increased use of cyber tools to spread misinformation. Clearly, cyber threats to alliance security, to NATO and allies, are becoming more frequent, complex, destructive, and coercive. And certainly, threats today can take more shapes and come from multiple directions, and also blur the lines between peace, crisis, and war, the very definition of hybrid threats. And I think in realization of this and recognition of this, we have seen, certainly at NATO, the understanding of cyber defense to undergo profound evolution since its inception years ago. NATO has moved from a narrow focus on technical network defense to an approach driven by geopolitical and operational imperatives. And cyber defense today has become part of NATO's core task of collective defense within NATO's broader deterrence and defense posture. And what this needs us to do is, on the strategic level, this of course starts with clarifying red lines. And here, allies made clear that international law applies in cyberspace, and NATO supports a norms-based approach to cyberspace. In other words, there's agreement that there are rules that govern the space, and we need to abide and uphold them during peacetime and during crisis, and that there can be consequences for those who transgress. Allies also clarified that an attack using cyber or hybrid methods has the potential to spur an Article 5 response of the Washington Treaty, where an attack on one ally is treated as an attack on all allies. And all allies also made clear that NATO is prepared to employ the full range of capabilities, including cyber, to deter, defend against, and counter the entire spectrum of cyber threats, including in the context of hybrid campaigns. Now, the range of response options that are at the disposal for allies to significant malicious cyber activities have actually been recently captured in a very important document adopted by defense ministers, and it's called a NATO Guide on Response Options to Significant Malicious Cyber Activities. It lays out response options for allies and the alliance in response to malicious cyber activities. Having said that, how exactly and if allies respond to unacceptable behavior in cyberspace individually or collectively remains a political decision. There are no agreed thresholds and there's no automaticity, and that is because that would only encourage malicious actors to test our resolve. Having said that, and coming back to the UN and the GGE documents and processes, in deliberations how to respond, I believe norms of responsible state behavior can play a very important role. They can assist allies with determining what response options are appropriate by elucidating how to apply and interpret commitments under the North Atlantic Treaty in cyberspace. Now, obviously, deterrence is often also referred to as one category as denial to be effective or to increase the costs too much that it makes no sense to attack. And as we strive to deter malicious cyber activities, a key priority, therefore, for NATO remains resilience, to effectively protect and defend our own networks and at the same time enhance the preparedness of allies to respond to cyber threats. And in 2016, allies actually pledged to strengthen and enhance the cyber defense of their national networks and infrastructure as a matter of priority. And the infamous cyber defense pledge has been certainly a good news story. Since 2016, every ally has upgraded their cyber defenses, and that makes us all more safe and secure. Now, more recently, defense ministers also agreed on the revision of the NATO baseline requirements for civil communications. And the revision takes into account new and emerging technologies such as 5G and their potential impact on NATO and allied civil and military communications. A third theme, partnerships and cooperation, which is also the topic of the session. Needless to say, a key theme in how we do effective cyber defense remains partnerships. Cyberspace is a shared space and its security a shared responsibility, and that is why NATO to date works closely with more than 40 partner countries, other international organizations such as the OSCE, UN, but also industry and academia to promote coherent responses to cyber threats. And I think one area of cooperation that's particularly encouraging is the fact that the engagement between the EU and NATO and cyber countering cyber threats has really grown from strength to strength over the last years. Today, we exchange real-time information between incident response teams. We participate in each other's exercises and work on training and research. And I believe policy coordination is set to continue with a particular focus on how both organizations are equipped to manage and respond to potential cyber crises. As has been mentioned by Haley before, both organizations, certainly also the EU, are working on efforts to impose costs to those who have attack us through cyber means. And the EU, of course, is working here on its diplomatic cyber toolbox and sanctuary regime. But equally, NATO, as I mentioned before, has basically adopted the NATO Guide for Strategic Response Options to Significant Malicious Cyber Activities. And I would say that those tools are actually quite complementary. So I would say that probably in the future, we will see more coordination between the two organizations of how these tools are deployed and when and what sort of the sequencing would be. And with that, allow me to stop here, and I'm happy to and look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Hi everybody, I'm Samantha Seller from the UK government, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. It's a pleasure to be here and take part in this discussion. I'm the head of the State Threats Deterrence in the Cyber Policy Department here at the FCDO, and my team in particular focuses on countering state-directed malicious cyber activity. Cyber attacks, from our perspective, are one example of how hostile state actors use multiple below-the-threshold deniable means to achieve their goals. And deterring cyber attacks is one part of addressing the hybrid threat. So I'm going to focus my introductory remarks on how the UK approaches addressing this issue, from a policy perspective, of course, because I'm a career diplomat. In responding to cyber attacks, we take into account how they sit alongside other similar incidents that make up the hybrid threat. Hostile activity in cyberspace has presented a unique policy challenge for the UK. While we've long had the capability to identify, analyse and understand the cyber threat from a technical perspective, the how, when and why we should respond to them as a government, in particular when it falls below the threshold of an act of war, is a significantly more complex question. The UK's approach overall to meeting the challenge is not only to identify, mitigate and counter the threat we face in cyberspace, but also to ensure that our actions influence and shape the behaviours of threat actors. 2017 was something of a watershed moment for us in the development of our policy. There was NotPetya, WannaCry, Parliament hacks, APT10 activity being discovered, to name just a few of the highlights. And whilst we as a community were all relatively clear on who was responsible for much of this activity, no one was prepared to call them out. And as such, it felt like there weren't really consequences to the actions. For the UK, this really galvanised our understanding that we had to change our approach. We began this by defining what our overall approach to deterrence should be. We instinctively understood that holding people to account would deter. We began with a degree of realism. We know we are highly unlikely to achieve absolute deterrence, as Ben sort of touched on in a moment. And in particular, where those acts fall beneath the act of war threshold. So no matter how good our defences or our resilience, there are always going to be cases that have an impact, although I know my military colleagues don't quite like me phrasing it like that. To deliver deterrence effect, governments must be able to demonstrate 7 key things. They need to be able to demonstrate capability, agility, coherence, resilience, the ability to attribute, their resolve, and their willingness to act in solidarity. Deciding how to respond brings in a whole range of interests: domestic and foreign policy, prosperity and security, sensitive intelligence equities, and a military perspective. All of those need to be part of the decision-making process. It will not work if it's just treated as a niche cyber issue. Linked to this, we are also clear that we do not need to respond to a cyber incident with cyber. We must instead draw from the full range of our national capabilities. And for those to truly have impact, we should seek to amplify those capabilities by coordinating our response with those of our like-minded partners. The more our experience of responding to these incidents has collectively grown, the more we've come to understand the importance as well of addressing the broad patterns of behaviour we are seeing in hybrid threats, rather than focusing on individual intrusion sets and individual incidents. The development in this thinking in recent years means that we've been able to demonstrate that governments can attribute, showing that the rules are there and that we will uphold them. We've also been able to clearly show that it's possible to form an international coalition that will speak out on these incidents. 11 countries joined us in attributing NotPetya to the Russian military before Salisbury. 14 supported our public attribution of APT10 by the end of 2010. 2018, I jumped back there, sorry everybody. We were also able to demonstrate our ability to collectively impose consequences on this behaviour, and that ability is steadily increasing, from timing attributions such as the Mabna Institute in Iran to coincide with US sanctions, to utilising the full range of options under the EU cyber diplomacy toolbox. We've also, most importantly, been able to demonstrate that we will not shy away from exposing hypocrisy, particularly in forums like the UN, highlighting what those who claim to be promoting cybersecurity are actually doing in practice. We're very clear that none of this is effective if we take a UK-only approach to cyber deterrence. From the outset, we've sought to work in partnership with our allies to increase the impact of our collective deterrence approach. As cyberspace is essentially borderless, any action taken will be most effective when countries work together, coordinating their responses and actions. Responses will be more impactful, less likely to result in uncontrollable escalation, and will send stronger deterrent messages if they're carried out alongside other states. The UK is committed to acting in solidarity with others when attacks don't directly affect the UK. We will support coordinated responses by sharing information with our partners and allies. It doesn't necessarily mean adopting the same response, but the effectiveness of any response will be increased if those taking action understand each other's approach and have the opportunity to support each other. I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you all. And we've discussed hybrid warfare, specifically pertaining to cyber. And the discussion of attribution has been well discussed, but equally we have to recognize that attribution with regards to cyber is considerably more difficult. In fact, non-repudiation is one of the main drivers towards why cyber is actually used as a particular vehicle. That, combined with the low cost and barrier to entry, I think is kind of part of the reason why we've seen really the ease with which many states across the world are actually leveraging and utilizing offensive cyber actions. We've actually seen evidence recently undertaken by third-party firms such as Citizen Lab detailing the growing economy where organizations actually provide tools that enable maybe less mature states with the ability to be able to leverage cyber as an offensive tool. And of course, perhaps more concerning is we're seeing wide-scale innovation from state adversaries in their ability to be able to find new ways to be able to bypass or new ways to be able to infect. The reality is that we live in a world today in which the adversary is getting better, the adversary is innovating, and the reality is that there is an asymmetry of warfare here. They have the ability to be able to track and understand the latest vulnerabilities. They have the ability to be able to understand some of the issues that we face in trying to defend an environment. And of course, our level of transparency and visibility into their operations is severely limited. So we have to accept that there is this asymmetry continuing. And then not only that, but the level of innovation is not just purely technical, but equally the ability to be able to spread misinformation. And I know the discussion with regards to COVID was raised, but equally we've seen the impact that misinformation has related to a global pandemic. The belief of conspiracy theories that 5G was related to coronavirus and so forth has huge ramifications across the globe. So as we kind of consider the concept of hybrid warfare, and in particular the use of cyber, we have some distinct challenges before us. Clearly, attribution remains one, but also the ease with which any state actor, regardless of maturity, has the ability to be able to leverage offensive cyber as a vehicle to achieve their ultimate ambitions. This can either be purchased through organizations that sell such technology, or equally the fluidity of the marketplace. And by the fluidity, there's an entire ecosystem of brokers making available tools or various different ancillary products to enable offensive cyber operations. And I think this is particularly one of the most challenging parts that we face is that, from an adversarial perspective, their ability to coordinate, their ability to be able to gather tools, their ability to share information between various different threat groups. Whereas we have this opaqueness where even organizations that aren't compromised, have been compromised, are really unwilling to open up and be transparent about what happened for fear of the reprisals, retribution, or public scorn. So what more can we do? And how do we actually address this? And Now, I'm not going to discuss the policy elements because that's not my area of expertise. The one area that I am particularly focused on is how can we ensure that the right information gets to the right organizations, gets in the hands of policymakers in the time that we need it to happen. You know, we've discussed a lot about public-private partnerships, and we have to accept the fact that we depend upon a public-private partnership to be successful. The majority of our infrastructure are hosted on within the private sector, and therefore the ability to be able to engage with social platforms, the ability to be able to engage with threat intelligence providers and understand the nature of the threat, the prevalence, where this is happening, how this is happening, and be able to provide that analysis to CERTs, government institutions, and policymakers quickly and effectively is going to be absolutely critical. You know, we talk about security, but quite frankly, if we look at some of the impacts, and you know, we've discussed the impacts of impacts against the health sector, this is not a question about security. This is a question about safety. This is a question about not just resilience, but the ability to be able to govern a society without malicious influence. And to stress, the manner in which we're going to be able to do this is by a strong public-private partnership. And this topic has been discussed now for a number of years, but we have to question, in a world in which during a pandemic, there were up to 100 million domains being registered spreading false information, in a world in which, you know, hospitals are being held hostage to give up or to pay ludicrous sums of money in order to be able to provide patient care, we have to question that. What we've done thus far, has it been successful enough? And I think if you were to ask somebody that was turned away from from treatment, or if you were to ask somebody that may have believed some of the misinformation from related to COVID and the impact that that had, whether that was true, I think we'll know the answer. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Many thanks to the panel for those really interesting remarks. I'm going to go straight to a question actually that's come through, and then I have a couple that I would like to ask, so I might just use that privilege in a moment. But I'll start with a question from Vladimir. I'm going to get names wrong, so I'll just apologize straight out if any. My pronunciation is terrible for people's names. Radunovic, I think. Anyway, he is from the Diplo Foundation and asked a really interesting question about finger pointing, i.e. calling on possible culprits, without a common and transparent methodology for attribution. And does this bring a risk of misattribution and misunderstanding? And Vladimir is keen particularly to have the answer towards developing countries and war-torn regions, where perhaps there's even less capacity for allowing attribution. And is worrying about the trend also that sort of following a trend of bigger countries, more prominent countries, pointing fingers. And who would like to take that question first? Thanks, Ben.
Thanks. Interesting question, certainly, and I know him quite well, so I know where he's coming from on this one. I think he hits on a very important point here, is kind of sometimes the mysteriousness how states come up with attribution. Now, I think what is fundamentally true is that attributing is and will remain a sovereign decision. States will reserve the right to do that or not to do that. But it is also true, if you want to build coalitions, then it makes sense to share with your allies how you make such decisions. And this is why allies actually at NATO are actively sharing their attribution frameworks and kind of inform each other how they come up with these decisions and what steps they are taking, which in turn, of course, then creates trust, transparency, but also confidence in each other's capabilities and capacities. With regard to what does this signal to states with lesser capabilities, I believe so far we have seen quite restraint when it comes to calling out cyber activities by states, and to only a few where I would say that they're actually quite capable of doing such a process. Having said that, also, I mean, the whole fact that misattribution is a problem and can create conflict, that's actually an entire work stream of the UN GGE that we heard before, but also regional organizations when we talk about confidence building measures to reduce the risk of conflict stemming from the use of information communication technologies. And I know a little bit about that because I was previously responsible for cyber at the OSCE, that have developed quite a significant amount of confidence building measures that are designed to reduce the risk of conflict stemming from the use of information communication technologies. And that was exactly the point, that we create mechanisms and channels that can be used by states to prevent escalation and put in place steps that allow states to actually approach each other and raise concerns in a structured manner. So I think that's what I would add to that, is that there are mechanisms to prevent that. We also have not seen states going wild with attribution so far, for good reason, because it is a difficult process. And if you do, you want to make sure that allies and your partners think that you have a good system and framework in place that allows you to do so. So it is in your interest to share those frameworks with your allies in order to promote transparency, but also credibility.
Thanks, Ben. Marina, I think you wanted to come in there too.
Yes, very briefly, thank you. I do not agree to what Ben said. And I'm really unfortunate that states have not done enough attribution. Because attribution is a very clear signal saying that's not okay to do what you do. You are behind that, and we will have countermeasures. We will react to your wrongful doings. Attribution, of course, has to be reliable. And I know that we have enough in the EU technical information, technical skills to do proper attribution. The problem is political. Because once you say that somebody is behind, you have to be ready for countermeasures. You have to be ready that it will be said against you the same way. We've seen that in the EU. We have the excellent diplomacy toolbox, and I'm really sorry that we are so weak in using that. We are not even able to do collective attribution. So my call would be to do more attribution, to have clear statements, clear names. No useless finger pointing, agree, but when you have grounds, because it's not Agatha Christie murder, it's more like poisoning cases we've seen recently. You have to convince your partners, you have to convince your allies, and you have to exchange information to convince your partners and allies. So I call for attribution, because with more attribution, we will have less gray zones and we will have much clearer picture.
Thanks, Marina. Anybody else like to come in at this point? Thanks, Raj.
I would tread caution with regards to attribution, and we have to accept the fact that there are adversaries that are very capable and are leveraging what we call false flag operations. In other words, leveraging and utilizing technical indicators in order to be able to infer involvement from other parties. And this level of activity is something that is escalating. So I understand the desire to do more attribution, absolutely understandable, but equally, we have to understand that technical indicators as a means to be able to do in order to be able to do attribution does have its limitations. And then the ability to be able to conduct a proper investigation is fraught by the fact that in many cases, those individuals or those assets that you wish to investigate are outside of jurisdiction. And I do want to stress, I know GDPR was raised earlier, but what's equally challenging is that we're making the environment more difficult. And so whilst GDPR was a tremendous success from a privacy perspective, the security impact of GDPR means that the ability to do such an investigation is made more difficult. So I understand the need, but I would kind of urge caution here, because it is a lot more difficult than it's ever been.
Thank you. I'll move on now in the interest of time to a question from Alexander Cook, who's a policy assistant at ECSO. The question is initially to Ben, but I am interested in other people's views. So please, Ben, could you start off with this question, where you alluded to deploying cyber tools offensively to deter malicious activity? Alexander would like to know whether does adopting cyber by punishment posture, in addition to deterrence by denial, pose difficulties for NATO, given its status as a defensive military alliance? Thanks, Ben.
Interesting question. So he's absolutely right, Alexander, that NATO is a defensive military alliance. So whatever we do in all domains is about defense and not about offense. Having said that, so a key priority for us is deterrence by denial through resilience and all the other steps that I have outlined before. Having said that, allies have been clear that they are prepared under certain circumstances to react when red lines are crossed. And I alluded to some of them before, which is essentially the applicability of international law if law is broken, or if a cyber attack rises to an Article 5 incident, allies do reserve the right to react. Now, that's not necessarily through cyber means. So they're not saying that if there's a significant cyber attack, we're going to call NATO and going to hit back with another cyber response. It can be a whole range of different measures, including diplomatic, but also through partnerships or negotiations or engagements. So cyber is not always necessarily responded by cyber. On top of it, I think it's very important to note that as in other domains, NATO does not own offensive cyber effects. We also don't own tanks or ships. These are owned by allies. So it is true that if there is agreement and consensus, NATO commanders can request sovereign effects from allies if a mission to defend NATO so requires. But in summary, we are a defensive alliance. It's about defense and not about offense. But if it is necessary, we can rely on allies to provide us with tools that are necessary to defend the alliance, also in terms of cyber.
Thanks, Ben. Would anyone else like to come in on that question? Thanks, Urania.
Thanks. It's just that, well, in the EU, we obviously do not use that terminology of deterrence, etc. But we still have some tools which can should de facto deter the adversaries. And Heli spoke about that cyber diplomacy toolbox in her keynote speech. One of the tools which is quite new is the cyber sanctions regimes, which member states agreed on last year, and on 30th July 2020, the Council placed first 6 persons and 3 entities under the cyber sanctions regimes for their involvement in in several cyber attacks and attempted cyber attacks, including the WannaCry and NotPetya cyber attacks, Operation Cloudhopper, and the attempted cyber attack on the OPCW.
Thanks,
That's
Irena.
from my side. Thanks.
I'll move on now to a question from Luke Huxtable from RAND Europe. He has a question which refers to red lines and how can nations make better use of red lines to deter hybrid threats? when malicious hybrid activity is often really designed to sit below the threshold that might lead to escalation. Who would like to start addressing that? Thanks, Raj.
I mean, it's a really good question, and I think part of it kind of plays down to the fact that the ultimate objective of a specific campaign, and you know, Luke is absolutely correct that there will be those campaigns that do sit below the threshold. So, for example, you know, most recently we identified a campaign of nation-state espionage, specifically against the defense and aerospace industry. But of course, it is possible to identify them. It is possible to be able to even get some degree of technical details to infer likely attribution. But then equally, there will be those hybrid activities that I would argue, you know, don't sit, that aren't necessarily particularly quiet and aren't particularly difficult to spot. And so for me, those red lines really begin with the definition of the impact of a specific threat and ensuring that the identification of those particular impacts and the likely response as a result of that will be critical. And so for me, this really begins with trying to understand the nature of the adversary, the types of campaigns they're doing, and what determines and what decrees a red line.
Thanks, Raj. Anyone else like to come in on that question? Thanks, Marina.
What I'd like to add, I also addressed it during the attribution. The less we have gray zones, the easier it is to define where are the red lines. So that's why it's not enough repeating international law applies to cyber. We've been doing it since 2013 globally and EU even longer. Now it's time to start looking into the norms, into very specific cases, how to apply international law to cyber. Haley made it very clear, and I 100% agree. We do not need any new agreements, international agreements at the moment, because we're not able to conclude them in the United Nations. But what we need more clarity, and we need clarity even in the case maybe we might need some new norms. At the beginning, political norms or responsible state behavior. But for me, the key word is clarity. Less gray zones, more clarity, also with the red lines. Thank you.
Thank you. Samantha?
Just to come in on that, I mean, it's a really good point about the clarity in the UK. About 2 years ago now, our Attorney General made a point of clarifying how we from the UK understood international law to apply in cyberspace. And that was absolutely key for us in sort of setting out what those red lines are and empowering us to take more meaningful action against issues that fell within those boundaries. So it's a very useful step for allied countries to take.
Thanks, Samantha. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, just to add my voice also to what was just said, I think what is important is that more states come forward with their national reading or position when it comes to the application of international law in cyberspace in order to create more transparency. My worry is that while allies are very forthcoming and open to this, other states are not so open to do the same. So we are left again in a limbo when it comes to, you know, some are very forward-leaning, transparent, and work towards these goals, and others not engaging in this debate and still calling for treaties. So where does that leave us?
Thanks, Ben. Marina, please come back.
I think that it leads us to closer cooperation among like-minded. Because, as I said, we are not naive. We understand that there are not going to be any binding rules within the framework of the United Nations, because we use the same words, we act differently. But it leads to much closer cooperation of like-minded, and I think that here, with attribution and more clarity on international law, like-minded should do the next step further, and then maybe other regions will also look at that.
Thank you. It's an interesting question, and thank you, Luke, for that. So I'm going to move on to a question from Jari, who's the senior advisor at the parliamentary group of the Centre Party at the Parliament of Finland. And it's a question initially to Samantha, which refers to Brexit. So how to ensure that good cooperation and exchange of views and best practices in countering hybrid threats continues between the UK and the EU after Brexit. From the Finnish point of view, cooperation is especially important in strategic communication in order to counter false news in particular. Would you like to start off with that, please, Samantha?
I'm going to be honest, like is a very strong word. Brexit is an awkward thing for civil servants to talk about at the moment. So I think that we should just be very clear that cooperation is a fundamental part of the UK approach. Our approach to deterring malicious cyber activity sits within the international pillar of our national cybersecurity strategy. So that sends a clear message to our allies that as far as we're concerned, cooperation is key to delivering what we're trying to do, Brexit or not. In practice, the sensitivity of the things that we have discussed with like-minded partners has meant that we have always traditionally done this in a bilateral context, in small groups, to kind of build the understanding amongst like-minded parties before we then take it to much bigger forums. And I don't see that approach changing for Brexit. We have excellent cooperation, it's growing all the time, and our ability to share sensitive information continues to improve. So I think that we will just continue to grow on the things that we have been learning in the last few years. And in many ways, the COVID experience has challenged us again to think about how we do that in a slightly disconnected way.
Thanks, Samantha. Could I bring anyone else, please, in on this subject of Brexit? Because it's not really just a question to the UK, is it? Please, Marina.
Sorry for speaking so much. Promise I'll be silent in the second part. But the center in Helsinki is also unique. It's a hybrid. It's a center of excellence of both EU and NATO. So even if we're going to lose UK in the EU or have, I hope, hopefully some agreement for cooperation, you'll still stay in NATO, which means that anyway the cooperation will continue. And as Finland was mentioned, I would argue that the Center of Excellence in Finland, the hybrid center, is an excellent example of how EU and NATO can cooperate with all our allies and partners. Thank you.
Thank you. Irina, you wanted to come in. Thank you.
Yeah, in fact, it was almost everything what I wanted to tell was told by Marina now. Well, I still believe that it's clear that the UK remains the very close, like-minded country for the EU. So obviously, some new purely bilateral format of cooperation will be established, but there is also that platform of EU-NATO cooperation, where the UK is still an ally, and indeed the Helsinki Center of Excellence is an excellent multilateral platform connecting EU member states and NATO allies. Thank
you very much. I'm going to come back to another question from Alexander Cook from ECSO. And Alexander is asking, how could AI-enabled cyber weapons operating at machine speeds without human oversight affect escalation dynamics? Particularly, he's thinking of automated response and offensive defense mechanisms. Would anyone like to start to address this issue? Thanks, Raj.
Sure. So, I mean, the threat is already at breakneck speed. We only need to look at the spread of, say, for example, something like WannaCry and how that spread across the world literally within hours, where the response needed to be certainly quicker from a broader industry perspective. But I think, you know, the point with regards to the leveraging AI or leveraging kind of machine learning models to be able to be able to spread things like misinformation definitely is a particular concern. And, you know, I want to kind of draw your attention maybe to the use of deepfakes. We've recently actually developed a deepfake lab today where the ability to be able to spot the use of deepfake technology as a means to be able to spread information is a viable technology today. And for me, this kind of comes back to my earlier point, which is, you know, the discussion from the panelists have talked about like-minded institutions. And of course, the discussion was related to other public bodies. But the reality is that the level of engagement that has to happen with the private sector is probably, and I'm not saying probably more important, but just as important. You know, it is the private sector research institutes, the ability to be able to understand the use of model hacking within, or within cars, for example, or for example, the use of model hacking against facial recognition systems being used at our airports today. Likewise, understanding how deepfake technology is being leveraged, but also how it can be detected. And this level of research and insight is happening today within the private sector. And I would stress that, and of course you would expect me to say this, but unless there is closer collaboration with the private sector, a real alignment to understand who's, where the threats are coming from, who they're targeting. I mean, today, the private sector can tell you for this state-sponsored ransomware attack, these are the countries being impacted. That's the level of insight that's going to happen. And so, perhaps you would have expected me to answer it in this way, but in order to understand how the adversary is evolving, how they're innovating, how the campaigns are occurring, and what technologies and how we can leverage technologies to try and stop that, that means that we've got to get a lot closer alignment between public and private sector. And there are some very good examples, but there needs to be more.
Thank you. Who else would like to come in on that question? If not, I'd like to move on to a broader question, slightly away from cyber, which is worth, I think, discussing. And this is the concept of hybrid activity as being a release valve for other activity. There is an argument that suggests that countries, organizations, actors acting using hybrid activity is perhaps a better alternative to the alternative. And there is an argument that suggests that whilst actors are conducting hybrid attacks and maybe testing or playing in that space, at least they're not doing what could and maybe was previously deemed as worse. I'd like your thoughts on that, please. Anyone can go first. Marina, can I ask you to come in on it?
Well, I wasn't silent because I do not have good answer. I really do not. I don't know what to say on that topic, and I was just suggesting maybe somebody from the audience can be unmuted and give their thoughts about that.
I don't think that's possible to bring them in talking to Rebecca, but it's a good question. The question comes more directly from understanding hybridity, not just in terms of cyber, and I'm trying to move the conversation away from cyber discussion, which it has rather dominated, and perhaps there's trying to understand why that's the case. Why does cyber dominate so much in hybridity? Which I think has naturally happened in this seminar for obvious reasons. Thanks, Irina.
If I may, just my opinion why cyber, I would tell that it's together with the disinformation, it's the most available and most efficient tool, and the one which is easiest to disguise or to keep it under the radar and difficult to attribute. This is also why it's so efficient.
If I could come in as well, I think from our perspective, it's still, though, ultimately recognizable of the whole picture of hybrid threats. Cyber is still a very dominant piece in it. It's something that we
have the capability that we've invested in looking at. And then once you sort of work out the policy and the process around cyber, you then can apply it more broadly to the bigger holistic picture. And that's certainly from a UK approach how we try and do it, is just sort of looking at it from a broader hostile state actor angle, bringing in some of the geographic dynamics, the wider equities, but we almost sort of break it down into manageable chunks. Once you've worked out your policy and process, you can then scale it up accordingly, because we are a small and finite resource as well, I think, from a government perspective, so you kind of have to take it step by step.
Thank you. I think it would be useful then to comment on what one of the comments I read from Johanna, who isn't here, and I think so fair to kind of touch on something that she had written, and that's about the weaponization of what are seen really as foundations of national power, diplomacy, economy, finance, and intelligence, and the rule of law. And I know Ben touched a little bit on resilience, but could I please get your thoughts then on societal resilience, and how society can act or become more resilient against hybrid threats? Thanks, Ben.
I mean, I hate to bring it back to cyber, but that's the line of work I'm in, cyber defense policy, and certainly when you talk about societal resilience, we talk about end user resilience, and the need for society and users of information communication technologies to be aware and tech savvy and understand what they're doing online and with their devices, and what the pitfalls are. But also there's a responsibility by states to educate and to develop mechanisms where citizens can turn to if they need assistance or want to report activities that maybe can be positioned in the hybrid sphere. So when it comes to societal resilience, I think in terms of cyber, it's end user awareness and being tech savvy, and to understand what safe use of the internet and ICTs is. And I think that's something that we have not been doing enough. That's what we need to continue focus on. There's this overused phrase that in the end of the day, the end user is still the weakest link when it comes to cyber defense. It is true. That's the facts. So more focus needs to be put on how they use those devices, and especially since they're becoming more and more powerful, and can be exploited, especially in the current times when it comes to COVID. They're being overused and more used. So sorry to put it a bit back to cyber, but this is one of the low-hanging fruits, so to say, to answer your question.
Anyone else like to comment on societal resilience against hybrid threats? Thanks, Marina.
Yes, thank you. Well, I come from Estonia, yeah? So which means that I would argue that our society has been under the threats of information operations, cyber threats, since the very day we regained independence in August of '91. So I think that resilience comes with education. I very much agree with what has been said. Resilience comes with cyber hygiene. Well, my country is a country which has had the privilege of having online services now for more than 30 years. Online voting, online government work, e-government, taxation, and so on and so on and so on. So to have this, you need also educate your population. With misinformation campaigns, I think that the pure fact that our eastern neighbor has educated us since '91 has made also our people more resilient. I remember when we were joining EU and talking, EU and NATO, talking about information operations, everybody laughed at us. Today, Western Europe is discovering the same thing, that information operations do take place, that hybrid threats are out there. So it's experience, education, and I would, in this context, I would also like to say that, for example, what External Action Service is doing with, for example, the East Task Force. working precisely on disinformation coming from the east flank, our eastern neighbor, but now expanding it also to the COVID false information and fake news is a great example that it can be fought, and societies can be taught and societies can be educated. Although I agree it's a very fine line, because you can't educate journalists without being very close to crossing the line of media freedom. So it has to start at school, and it has to continue until we die.
Irena, please come in.
Yeah, thank you. Just to add to this, you might be aware that under Action 1 of the Joint Framework 2016, member states conducted an exercise called Hybrid Risk Survey, where through a very specific questionnaire, they try to identify their national vulnerabilities with the aim to then analyze these responses and to find out whether the EU can facilitate any joint response or addressing them jointly. And as one of the results of the questionnaire, member states identified some sectors where they need more insight, and one of them was exactly societal resilience. And it's not obviously it very much relates to education, and it's in cyber field, obviously, but it also is in the field of information, and indeed not only East Task Force of Stratcom, but the whole Stratcom is doing a good job, and it is related currently with COVID disinformation campaign. But there are other cleavages the counter adversaries can use, like manipulating the discourse on immigration, for example. It was very strong in previous years, and it will reappear, I'm sure.
Thanks, Irena. Really interesting. Anyone else like to come in on the issue of societal resilience before I move on and we move towards a close?
Well, I think, the only thing I'd like to add is that this is probably one of the most important areas of resilience, because quite frankly, and I know Ben mentioned it was low-hanging fruit, but it's probably the most difficult element that we have. Today, where do people go if they see fake news or fake information? The best you can do is probably block somebody. Where do you go if you suspect that there's been a cyber attack? I mean, has anybody ever tried to go to their local to their local police station and report a cybercrime? The reality is that this is not simple. This is the most difficult task that exists. And I have to commend EC3, the European Cybercrime Center. We co-founded No More Ransom as an example. And there you have the ability to be able to report crime directly to law enforcement agencies across the world. But we mustn't kid ourselves. We're not going to have leaflets or, a 1-hour training session for people and expect them to be cyber resilient. This is what I believe this is the biggest challenge that we have, is for people to see that, a cyber attack is not cyber, it is impacting real life. Whether it's disabling the ability for hospitals, whether it's influencing elections, whatever the answer may be, this is the biggest challenge that I think we have before us.
Thanks, Raj. Okay. First of all, I would like to thank the panel for what I think has been a really interesting discussion, both in the remarks and the questions. I'd like to particularly thank Irena for coming in at the last minute there, much appreciated, and covering for Yannick. So thank you, and thanks again to the questions that have come in on the side. And I'm sorry if I didn't get to one or two of them that came in at the end. For me, I think this has been a really interesting discussion, and we have perhaps talked a great deal about cyber, but there's probably, and I think it's come across, really important reasons for that. For me, I think that some of the lessons we learned from cyber in terms of hybrid threats or hybridity or you know, grey zone or some of the other, you know, sub-threshold threats. And I think this terminology gets a bit lost and confused sometimes. There are lots of ways of talking about this. So one wouldn't want to close off the discussion just because we're not using particular terms. But I think that some of the stuff we've learned and talked about cyber go for other threats within that sphere of warfare, conflict, or threat towards nations or actors. So thank you very much for your time. I know that the next session will be due to begin, and it's my pleasure to introduce that. And actually leading on beautifully from this, it is a session on cyber skills and awareness, which is the essential missing ingredient. So I would like everybody listening to please stay tuned, and thanks once again.